There are moments on live television that feel bigger than politics. Moments where the noise stops, the usual games disappear, and the whole country finds itself holding its breath. This was one of those nights. Picture it, a Tuesday evening in New York. A studio buzzing with lights, cameras, and an audience expecting the usual back-and-forth debate. Nothing out of the ordinary. Just another episode of a political talk show. But what unfolded was nothing anyone could have scripted. Sitting across from the host was Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the young leader of Burkina Faso. He wasn't there to pick a fight. He wasn't there for sound bites. His purpose was simple: to explain his country's struggle for independence, and to talk about Africa's future without foreign interference. Across from him, the other guest, Karoline Leavitt, a sharp-tongued political figure, famous for cutting people down with a smile. Producers thought it would be a spirited, maybe even fiery, discussion. They had no idea what was coming. For the first 20 minutes, Traoré spoke with calm precision. No drama, no grandstanding, just a measured, thoughtful voice laying out what his people have lived through. And then, it happened. Karoline leaned forward, pointed at him, and spat out 2 words that would hang in the air like poison. "Sit down, boy!" The room froze. The audience gasped. Even the host was stunned into silence. Within seconds, social media lit up like wildfire. But in that tense silence, all eyes turned to Traoré. Would he snap back? Walk off? Fire words just as sharp? No. What he did instead left the entire studio, and eventually the nation, shaken. He rose slowly from his chair. Not with rage, not with theatrics, but with the steady grace of someone who has carried heavier burdens than insults on television. His eyes locked on Karoline for a moment, but his voice, when it came, wasn't for her. It was for everyone listening. "I come from a place," he began softly, "where boys are forced to become men before they have the chance to dream." The room was silent. You could feel every person leaning in. "You can call me boy here," he continued, his voice low but steady. "But where I come from, boys carry nations on their backs. They lead when no one else will. They protect others from starving. That is what it means to be a boy in my country." The cameras caught it, the smirk fading from Karoline's face. The crowd frozen. And then he went even deeper. "I buried my father under an open sky. No speeches. No cameras. Just the sound of my mother's grief. He died in a war fueled by outsiders who treated our lives as bargaining chips. So, when you tell me to sit down," he paused. The weight of his silence was almost unbearable. "Understand that where I come from, standing tall is not a choice. It is survival." An elderly woman in the front row wiped tears from her cheeks. Viewers across the country were stunned. This wasn't a political moment anymore. It wasn't a debate. It was truth, raw, human truth, breaking through the screen. And in that truth, America saw something rare. Dignity that could not be broken, courage that could not be silenced, and the kind of leadership that doesn't need to shout to be heard. That night, a single insult meant to humiliate one man ended up revealing the strength of an entire people. "Sit down, boy." Those words were meant to put him in his place. But instead, they unlocked something the entire country would never forget. Traoré didn't flinch. He lifted his eyes and spoke, his voice steady but heavy with lived truth. "Boy, do you mean the child who watched his village burn? The boy who read books by candlelight because the power never came back after the colonizers left? That is the boy you see before you." The silence in the studio was electric. Then, without a word, one of the other panelists, a decorated U.S. Army veteran, pressed his hand to his chest. You could see it in his face. Recognition. Respect. He knew what sacrifice looked like, and he knew Traoré carried it in his bones. The young captain's voice never wavered, though his eyes glistened. "You don't have to like me," he said, staring straight into the camera now, speaking to millions at home. "But you will not erase me." At first, just one clap echoed from the back of the audience. Then another. And suddenly the entire studio was on its feet, applauding, not out of pity, but out of reverence for something rare. Something real. Karoline sat frozen. For the first time since the broadcast began, she looked small. And then Traoré did something no one expected. He smiled gently, almost painfully, and spoke again, this time softer than before. "You see a soldier. But I was raised by a woman who worked with her bare hands. My mother sold firewood to pay for my schooling. She walked miles in broken sandals so I wouldn't have to. She hid her hunger so I would never feel mine." The cameras cut to Karoline. The smirk was gone. "My mother never told me to sit down," Traoré continued. "She told me to stand up. Even when it hurts." A hush fell over the room. Then, clear enough for the microphones to catch, a little girl in the front row whispered to her father, "He sounds like you, Daddy." That was the moment grown men in that studio began to cry. Traoré's voice broke just slightly as he went on, "So when you call me boy, you are not insulting me. You are insulting every mother who ever carried a nation on her back." The silence that followed was almost holy. Even the host, usually quick to cut in, had nothing to say. And then, another voice cut through. Colonel Jacob Whitmore. Silver-haired. Highly decorated. A man who had seen battle. He rose slowly to his feet, eyes wet. "He's right," the colonel said, his voice trembling. "I served in Liberia. I've seen boys like him carry burdens no man should. Calling him boy is not debate. It's an insult to every soldier, every fighter, every family who has paid the cost of war." Then, in front of the entire nation, Colonel Whitmore crossed the stage. His hand shook slightly as he extended it to Traoré. "Captain," he said, "thank you. Not just for defending your people, but for reminding us what real leadership looks like." The two men shook hands, and the studio erupted again. This time, the applause was louder, richer, and filled with tears. Even viewers who had never heard of Burkina Faso felt they were witnessing something far bigger than politics. Meanwhile, Karoline was unraveling. Her face flushed red, her voice cracking with desperation. "Oh, come on," she snapped. "Are we really pretending he's some kind of saint now?" The room recoiled. Gasps. Shaking heads. She had overplayed her hand. But Traoré didn't raise his voice. He simply turned, calm and unshaken. "It's not about sainthood," he said. "It's about humanity." The audience erupted once more. And Karoline, the woman who thought she could break him with two careless words, sat there, drowning in her own silence. And then, from the crowd, a young black student stood up, her voice trembling but clear. "He doesn't just sound like a leader, he sounds like the future." Her words cut through the air like a blade. "No. You apologize for being cruel." It wasn't just a comeback. It was a wound ripped open in front of millions, and everyone watching could feel it. Karoline's smile faltered. The confidence she had carried onto that stage was slipping like sand through her fingers. She had underestimated this man. Now, in real time, her arrogance was unraveling for the world to see. The camera zoomed in on Captain Traoré's face. He wasn't angry. He wasn't shaken. And that was what made him dangerous to people like her. He sat calm, centered, with the kind of peace that only comes from carrying scars no one else can see. The young student who had spoken moments earlier sat back down, but her eyes never left. Karoline. The energy in the studio had shifted completely. This was no longer a political debate. It was a reckoning. A moment of truth that people would remember for years. Karoline tried to laugh, forcing out a brittle line. "Oh, come on. This is America. We're allowed to disagree." But nobody laughed with her. The cameras panned across the audience, tears being wiped away, hands pressed over hearts, faces wet with emotion. The weight of the moment was sinking in. Then Traoré leaned forward. His voice was low, almost gentle. "Disagreement is healthy," he said. "But disrespect kills the conversation. And when you kill the conversation, you kill understanding." The applause that followed wasn't wild or frantic. It was slow, heavy, like a hymn for something that had just been buried in that room. Karoline stared ahead, motionless, as her insult was swallowed up by something much greater, truth. And then, with a quiet resolve, Traoré reached into his jacket pocket. From it, he pulled out a letter. Worn, creased, edges frayed. A letter that had clearly been read and touched too many times. "This," he whispered, "was written by my younger brother. 2 days before he was killed during a protest. He was protesting for food. The room fell into absolute silence. Even the cameras seemed to hesitate. Every eye was locked on that fragile piece of paper. Traoré unfolded it carefully, as though afraid the paper itself might break. His hands were steady, though the pain in his eyes was impossible to miss. He wrote, Traoré continued, his voice catching slightly, "Big brother, if I die, promise me they won't forget why." Gasps rippled through the audience. Some wept openly. Others bowed their heads. And then Traoré looked up, holding the letter toward the lights. "So no," he said firmly. "I will not sit down. Because I carry the memory of those who were forced to kneel." Across the table, Karoline's hands trembled. She blinked rapidly, her face drained of color. For once, she had no words. Meanwhile, online, the clip was already exploding. Millions of Americans were sharing it, passing it across timelines and group chats with just one word, watch. Back in the studio, the host finally found his voice. His tone was different now, softer, unguarded. "Captain Traoré," he asked, "is there anything you want to say to the American people watching right now?" The young leader turned directly to the camera. His eyes steady. His words careful. "You don't need to know where Burkina Faso is to understand dignity. You only need to know what it feels like to be invisible. I have never asked for pity. I ask only for eyes that truly see." Karoline's jaw tightened. She knew it was over. This was no longer her stage. Traoré wasn't dominating with volume, but with truth, and truth was louder than anything she could say. And then something shocking happened. One of the camera operators quietly set his equipment down, walked across the stage, and extended his hand to Traoré. The microphones picked it up clearly. "Thank you," the cameraman said, his voice shaking. "Thank you for reminding me what honor looks like." The studio gasped. The audience rose again in applause. And just when it seemed the night had reached its peak, a middle-aged black woman in the third row stood up. She hadn't been called on. She didn't ask permission. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "I didn't come here to say anything. But after what I just heard, I can't stay silent." The woman in the third row rose to her feet, her hands trembling, her voice heavy with years of pain. "I have to say this," she began, and suddenly the cameras turned to her. The audience quieted. You could feel the weight of her words before they came. "My son served in Afghanistan," she said, her voice cracking. "And he came back in a box." The room stopped breathing. They called him a boy, too. Even in uniform. Even after he gave everything. Her eyes flooded with tears as she looked at Captain Traoré. "When you spoke, it felt like my son stood up again." The gasp that rippled through the studio was so loud it bled through television speakers. The camera found Traoré's face. He didn't speak. He just nodded gently, his own eyes wet, meeting the mother's grief with the silent understanding of someone who had buried too much himself. Karoline shifted in her chair, as if she wanted to cut in, but even she could feel it. This wasn't her stage anymore. This moment belonged to something larger than ratings, larger than politics. And then the mother added words that cracked the entire room open. "America needs men like you. Not loud voices who mock pain." The crowd rose to its feet. The applause thundered, not once, not twice, but in a wave that seemed to go on without end. Karoline had lost. And she knew it. "This is a setup," she hissed into her mic, her voice sharp, desperate. "This isn't journalism, this is theater." The host turned slowly toward her, pulled the earpiece from his ear, and let it drop to the desk. His voice was steady, but firm. "Karoline," he said, "the cameras are rolling. You made this moment. You just didn't expect it to speak back." Red-faced, she slammed her cue cards on the table, stood, and stormed off set. Her heels echoed like gunfire across the floor. The audience didn't boo. They didn't cheer. They just watched her go in silence. And then, from somewhere in the crowd, a whisper rose. She couldn't handle the truth. The cameras cut back to Traoré. Still seated. Still calm. "I didn't come here to shame her," he said softly. "I came here to tell the truth." The host swallowed hard, fighting to keep his composure. "Well, Captain, The truth is sitting in your seat. Outside the studio, the world was already on fire. Phones buzzing, newsrooms scrambling, hashtags trending. A message flashed across the control room from the White House press office. 3 simple words. We saw everything. Nobody knew what it meant, but everyone understood it mattered. When the broadcast resumed, the host leaned forward, asking carefully, "Captain Traoré, do you believe America can truly hear voices like yours?" Traoré's eyes locked with the camera. His tone was quiet, steady. "Yes. But only if America learns to listen when it's uncomfortable." Then, without warning, he shared a story no one expected. "Last year," he said, "I visited a children's hospital in Chicago. A little girl, 8 years old, showed me a picture she drew. 2 flags. One American. One from Burkina Faso. She said, 'You're both fighting for us.'" The audience broke again. Tears streaming. People holding each other. "That child understood something," Traoré continued, lowering his voice, "that many leaders have forgotten. She understood unity, dignity, humanity." And it hit viewers at home like a tidal wave. This wasn't about geopolitics. It wasn't about debate points. It was about heart. By the end of the night, the moment had already gone viral. Families stopped dinners to watch together. Barbershops turned up the volume. Teenagers crowded around phones on buses. The hashtag #SitDownBoy flipped into something new, not an insult, but a movement. People posted captions like, "I showed this to my students. Half the class was crying." Others wrote, "My father called me in tears. He said this reminded him of 1963. A teenager from Atlanta tweeted, "Didn't know who Captain Traoré was an hour ago. Now I want to be like him." What had begun as a cheap insult had become a national reckoning. And then, just when the studio thought it had seen everything, a new voice rose. An elderly white man in uniform stood slowly from the audience. A cane in one hand. Medals gleaming on his chest. His voice trembled as he asked, "Before he answers your final question, may I speak?" The room had gone quiet, so quiet you could almost hear hearts beating. An old veteran leaned forward, his voice shaking but steady. "I fought in Vietnam. I buried friends. I came home to a country tearing itself apart. I've seen anger. I've seen hate. But never in my life have I seen a man answer disrespect with such grace." He turned, pointing at Captain Traoré. "America doesn't just owe this man an apology. America owes him respect." No applause followed. Only silence and tears. Even the host lowered his head. Then, slowly, the veteran stood. Captain Traoré rose too. And in front of millions watching live, 2 soldiers, one from Africa, one from America, shook hands. That single gesture carried more truth than 1,000 speeches. And just when everyone thought the broadcast was over, the host received a note. His eyes widened. "Captain Traoré, we have a surprise guest." The screen lit up. A little girl appeared, the same child from the Chicago hospital he had spoken about earlier. She waved a paper flag colored red, white, and green. "Hi, Captain. You remembered me." The room melted. Adults cried openly. The host whispered, "My daughter's her age. You told me I was brave," the girl said with a glowing smile. "But tonight, you were the bravest." Captain Traoré pressed his hand to his chest, his lips trembling. "You give me strength," he told her. "You are the future I fight for." Then she said something nobody expected. "Next time someone tells me, 'Sit down, boy,' I'll tell them to stand up like Captain Traoré." The feed ended. The audience didn't just clap, they rose to their feet, because they knew what they just witnessed wasn't television anymore. It was history. Later that night, back in his hotel room, Captain Traoré sat quietly. His phone buzzed non-stop with calls from presidents, celebrities, and strangers. But it wasn't a call that stopped him, it was a letter slipped under his door. From the National Civil Rights Museum. "Dear Captain Traoré, tonight you didn't just speak for yourself. You spoke for every soul who was ever told to sit down, boy. We are preparing a permanent exhibition, Dignity Under Fire. We would be honored to include your story." He whispered to himself, Not for me, for all of them. Outside, crowds gathered. Not to protest, but to say thank you. 1 week later, the unexpected happened. Karoline Leavitt returned to that same studio. No cameras. No audience. Just her, holding a folded piece of paper. She asked that it be delivered to Captain Traoré. At a press conference the next day, he opened it. The note read, "I told you to sit down, boy. And you stood taller than I've ever seen a man stand. I was wrong. I don't expect forgiveness. But I hope my daughter grows up in a world where she learns from your strength, not my ignorance." The room fell silent. Traoré looked up and said, "We don't heal through silence. We heal through courage." And today, she showed courage. From that day on, even his fiercest critics called him something new, the man who made America listen. Months later, Captain Traoré spoke at the United Nations. But it wasn't his speech that broke the internet. It was when he held up a small hand-drawn American flag, the one that little girl had sent him. "This flag," he said, "was given to me by a child who believed I stood for something good. That means more than any medal." Then he looked straight into the camera and said, "America, don't just clap. Change."